Hello again, and welcome back to another video build. This time around, we're finally making something from the anime Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, and we really hope you enjoy it. This is easily one of my top 3 animes these days. And it has been for quite a while now. Everything from the story to the amazing artwork. I just love everything about it. In fact, we could probably have a long discussion about all the things we love about this show. So making some kind of a statue with Nezuko and Tanjiro was pretty much inevitable. As we go into this video build, there is a couple of things you should know. We're not going to talk so much about the STL files, the slicing, the printing, the curing, the washing, and so on. But rather, as a lot of you have been asking for, repeatedly, how we go about preparing, smoothing out and finishing off our raw 3D prints. Everything from the tools, the sanding, resin smoothing, even some remodeling, and actually combining materials and techniques from other hobbies as well. The second part of the video build will of course be all about how we paint this fantastic model. And as always, you'll find links to everything you need to know in the description. Since everything was printed in clear resin, I went ahead and put on a light coat of some filler primer. A filler primer is mainly used to smooth out some smaller imperfections to the surface, but in this case, I only used it to get a better view of what I've got to work with. Then I go over each and every piece, just checking to see what needs to be done with it. Some parts always need more work than others. And by doing this, I can sort of plan ahead. What would be smartest to start with? What would take the longest time? And stuff like that. We can start by separating all the printed parts into 2 groups. The one group would make up the bottom part. It's sort of a display base, only it's a really cool snapshot of his water breathing technique. And since it's being water and all, we didn't want to paint it, but rather do something fun with it in clear blue resin. The remaining parts will make up the main characters. Every now and then, we all get a failed print or two, but in this case, it seemed to be something fundamentally wrong with the files. And even though it might be tempting to just throw it away, I often choose to look at it as a possibility to learn something new. At least this way, you might get a bit more knowledge and even a bit more skilled with each project you do. In the end, I picked out a total of 4 pieces. They would definitely need some extra work, and they would serve as perfect examples of everything we go through. Then it's time to bring out my favorite toolbox. You definitely don't need all this stuff for this project, but I find it really handy to keep all my sanding stuff organized in one place. It's practical. Every sanding tool has its own purpose, whether it's some fine metal files, or even some homemade sanding sticks. I even glued some sanding paper onto some EVA foam. This actually makes it perfect for sanding curved surfaces. In fact, all this stuff makes it go easier and faster. But even so, the 2 things I use 90% of the time are my 2 favorite tools. One of them being sanding sticks. Well, actually, they're nail files, and they are quite inexpensive. You can buy them in bulks of 50 or more on eBay. My second favorite tool is plain sanding paper. And truthfully, if you're just starting out with this, you can basically get the whole job done with only these 2 things. As far as materials go, this time we're only sticking with some fast curing UV resin and some modeling putty. I chose to start with the print that had almost failed, and I thought it would make a good example to show you just how easily you can fix stuff like this. I start off by just doing some light sanding. Just in case you're new at this, remember, when working with any type of resin, and even when sanding your finished resin prints, make sure you use the correct breathing mask and protective gear. In my case, I only use a simple dust mask, because in addition to having an overall good ventilation in my workshop, I've also made a sort of a DIY dust collector. You might remember me putting this together back in the video where I made my DIY cardboard spray booth. So let's start with the venting holes. This is done with the rough side of a sanding stick, and by applying this rough sanding, it will give the resin something to grab onto and make sure it overall sticks better to your model. I don't believe there's no right or wrong way to do this, but when it comes to holes like this or other imperfections, I like to do it in 2 steps. First, I add 1 drop of resin, then I try and let it sag into the hole a bit, before quickly curing it with UV light. Then I apply a 2nd drop of resin. This will usually result in giving it a top bevel, so when you get around to sanding it, it's very easy to make it flush and smooth on the first try. I want this model to be very smooth, crisp and clean in the end. This is because when I think ahead to how I want to paint this, it's going to have very clean, sharp colors. And there's not going to be any kind of weathering. You won't get the chance to hide away anything. Everything has to be perfect. At this point, I was actually planning on fixing the gap in the leg with some modeling putty. But just as I was going to start with it, it became clear to me that the bottom part of the leg might become a bit too fragile, because I actually don't know how much weight or strain would be put on it later. So, just to be on the safe side, I decided to put in some support structures. It's actually a fast and easy quick fix. This is done by twisting up some steel wire, and then by placing it firmly inside the hollowed out print, making sure it connects with both the top and the bottom part. For the time being, adding some super glue is a good idea, just to make sure it stays in the correct place. Then it was time to mix up some 5-minute epoxy glue. And maybe, having only 5 minutes to work with might stress you out a bit. But as long as you have everything you need prepared, and you know all the steps to come, then just by working slowly and organized, I promise you'll have more than enough time. I made the vent hole inside the leg slightly bigger, and then by taking my time, I slowly poured the epoxy glue inside it. It seemed to have ended up pretty strong, so I might have been overthinking it a bit. But having left it to cure for an hour, I was back to the original plan, the epoxy modeling putty. It's perfect to cover up big gaps like this, but it's good for more than that. If we look at how the foot is connected to the right leg, the flow of the baggy pants, and the overlapping connection between them, it all looks very good, and everything is as it's supposed to be. But on the left side, that's another matter. There almost seems to be a piece missing on the inside, and there's clearly a gap between the parts. It simply doesn't look right. And that might be just my opinion, but I have been doing a lot of clay sculpting for over a couple of decades now, so I do want to change this a bit. Fortunately, this is exactly the type of thing that can be easily fixed with some modeling putty. And as with all epoxy mediums, it's a 2-part component with a 50-50 split, so be sure to mix it up thoroughly, giving it that uniformed color. You can start off by making a shape that roughly covers the area you want to fix. Make sure you push some of the material well inside the gap. And then, to make sure you get a smooth surface, you can just apply some water and start smoothing it out by just using your finger. Of course, using some sculpting stencils can also be a good choice. But in this case, you can just as easily smooth it out with a small teaspoon. This specific modeling putty is one that I usually use to customize my Gundam kits, but I have done some testing with it, so I know it works well with resin too. For the other leg, the one that I wanted to remodel a bit, I guess, just grab a piece of the modeling putty, then make a rough shape of how you want it to look. Then make sure the surface is dust free and dry. Then fix the modeling putty firmly in place. And of course, you can just reapply it or just adjust the shape and placement as you go. Then once you're happy with the look of it, just add some water and start smoothing out those transitions. And of course it's a given. The more time you spend on getting it nice and smooth, the less sanding you will have to do when it's cured. And it's also a good idea to grab the other part and do some test fitting, just so you don't create in the future problems. This is what it sounds like when it's fully cured. And it seems I did a good job of things, because I only had to do one quick pass with some 1200 grit sanding paper. A quick final test fitting, and then I could finally put the piece aside, ready to be painted. The next piece, of course, also had some holes in it. That would be the holes you put in on purpose when slicing it. This is of course done to prevent the vacuum and give the model an overall better chance to stick to the plate. And just as previously, I like to really look over the parts before I start with anything. And making sure all the other parts will fit nicely with it is just as important. Trust me, it may save you from a lot of headache. It actually seems that this piece would only need some sanding, and of course some resin to plug the holes. There is of course a lot of different ways and other materials you can use to go about this, but I find that the best reason for using resin on a resin print is that the materials are equally hard. That means that when you sand it down, you won't be able to see any traces of whatever you try to cover up. And this is done by simply using one application. One of the most common things you'll need to fix is to remove all those leftover little knobs from the support structures. I like to take away more of the rough parts with some sanding sticks, and they might sometimes be a bit too big and bulky for this. But a very useful and practical thing about these sanding sticks is that they can be easily cut down to perfectly match the curved surface you're working on. And not to mention the ability to maintain the sharp lines of the model, as with these checkered squares that have a slight height difference to them that you don't want to sand away. It might seem a bit slow and tedious in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it, you can work pretty fast this way. And once again, it's so important to make sure all the pieces fit perfectly together. You don't want to be struggling with this when you're halfway through painting them. And as you can see to the spot I'm pointing at, I had to Dremel away quite a bit of the model just to get the backpack to fit nicely. Well, I guess it's more of a wooden box actually. And with one more piece done, there's only a couple of more things I want to show you on the next two. First off, Nezuko's torso. It was actually an almost perfect printout. There was only a couple of support structures that I had missed on the first pass, and the outside of the cape was very clean and smooth. Except for this one thing, of course. There was a kind of a weird thin crack going all the way along the left side. Now this could easily be fixed with some modeling putty, or something quite similar. But since we're sticking with a lot of UV resin this time around, I thought I might show you how quickly we can fix this. And just as before, I like to do the filling in 2 steps. The first application, make sure to give it some time to slowly run deeper into the crevice. The second application, you can make sure to give it a slightly more height than the model has to begin with, and even smooth some out over a larger area. This way, when you come around to sanding it, you won't even see the slightest trace or outline of the crack that used to be there. And then we only had 1 piece left. There's 2 things I want to share with you on this one. Obviously, how to quickly fix the small crack on the left top side. And then there's a reason why I left the support knobs on the inside. Of course, if you peel off the support structures before curing your prints, it usually leaves a smooth, clean surface. But if you use your nippers to cut them away after it's been cured, they tend to grab away, or rather dig into the resin, so to speak, leaving a bit of a small crevice, which is actually perfect for this, as it's going to be on the inside, and you're left with less to sand away to make it fit. And speaking of making the parts fit perfectly, when it comes to keying of the resin models, you'll often have to adjust them, or maybe even remove them completely. And this is often in places that are hard to get to, so sanding them down can be pretty frustrating at times. I usually use my Dremel for this, but lately I've started to use this smaller and less powerful grinding tool. It's basically a cordless rechargeable Dremel type thing, and aside from it being very practical, the main difference, I guess, is that this one has less power. That means it doesn't accidentally grab onto your model and kind of dig into it. And maybe I'm not explaining this right, but if you have tried to use a Dremel on a resin print before, I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about. As for the smaller chip on the top right side, just take a piece of some masking tape and apply it firmly on the backside. Add a drop of resin, some UV light, and then you're just left with some sanding. For this part, I guess it all comes down to how much work you want to put into it. But since this is my hobby and a real passion for me, I like to get things as close to perfect as I can. If you look closely, there is an area that seems to have a slightly downwards falling curve, and the flow of it just doesn't look natural. So I decided to fill it in. And just like previously, using a bit of resin and just give it a bit of an overflow. And once it's cured, sand it down to the shape you desire. I've tested quite a few brands of this type of resin over the past year, and the one thing they all have in common is that the consistency is pretty thick, almost like syrup, which makes it pretty easy to control, and I'm sure you'll definitely master it rather quickly. That completes all 4 pieces that I picked out to demonstrate the most common things I do to prepare my raw printouts. The only thing remaining now is to give all the pieces a light coat of some filler primer. I like using a filler primer, as it will cover up whatever small imperfections I might have missed, but you can of course apply whatever primer you like. I find it really satisfying seeing all the pieces cleaned up, just waiting to finally be painted. But even with the primer fully dry, and because it is a filler, personally, I like to leave the pieces for a couple of days, just to make sure the primer fully hardens. But before I start to paint all of this, I thought I'd take 2 minutes to break it down and show you how I prepared the display base. The base mainly consists of 2 parts. The first part would be these waves of water that's meant to illustrate Tanjiro's water breathing technique. It's pretty simple actually. I just mix up some 2-part regular epoxy resin, which I then tinted in a dark blue color. I gave it a quick run through my tiny vacuum chamber, just to get rid of all those bubbles, which always looks so cool. And then I gently poured the resin into each and every piece. I've only done this on a much smaller scale before, so I was really excited to see how it all would work out. It took about a day or so to fully cure, and I do think they came out looking pretty good. The bottom part of the display base, which I really didn't like, was actually some kind of rope, just twisted around the bottom. It didn't suit the model, and I simply thought it looked totally misplaced. So I went ahead and made my own bottom for the display. Using Fusion 360, it was just a simple design that wouldn't take away any of the focus from the main model. It was printed out in PLA and sanded down smooth. And using a plain rattle can, I gave it a dark gunmetal finish. I also made sure that the design could hold a single strip of LED lights. I thought it might be a cool effect to have the waves light up. And I gotta admit, even unfinished, it looks pretty cool. And that's how I went from the hollowed out print to this look. However, there is still the issue of some leftover nubs from the supports and such. So I had to go over every piece and sand it down a bit. Once I got all the way up to 1200 grit, I did the final pass with some wet sanding. By the end of this build, I'm going to finish off all these water parts with a coat of resin. This will hopefully make them crystal clear and shiny again. To make sure there wasn't any leftover dust from the sanding, and to make sure the resin would stick properly, I cleaned off all the pieces with some cleaning alcohol. Hopefully, this is how shiny they will look in the end. But once the alcohol dries off, they get that flat, dull look again. Well, for now at least. And with all the pieces finally fully prepared, I couldn't help it. I just had to try and put it all together, just to see how it would look. I do believe I need an extra set of hands for this, so I didn't really get to see it fully assembled yet. But I did learn that when it comes to doing so, it would be smart to start from the bottom and working my way upwards. So then, time to do some painting. And you might have noticed this in some of my previous videos, but I like to keep a very clean setup, and I don't just mean OCD clean, but organized. For example, picking out the color palette for the paints you'll be using, maybe stuff to clean your airbrush, or setting up a spray booth, even making sure all the paint bottles are shaken up thoroughly. In my case, some of these open paint bottles might not have been used in several months. Basically, having a setup that allows you to work efficiently. I like mixing the colors directly in my airbrush cup. Just the paint, some airbrush thinner, and mixing it all with a toothpick. I know some people like covering the nozzle with the fingertips and then applying the air pressure. This will definitely get the paint mixed quickly, but it also shoots the paint all the way back into the airbrush and simply makes it a mess to clean. So, a simple toothpick. Once I find the right color and shade I'm looking for, I move on to applying it as a base coat. Now, for some of the pieces, like these legs, or pants really, there isn't any need to mask off any details or such. It's simply a matter of airbrushing on a good base, making sure I hit it from all the different angles, giving the whole piece a good and even coverage. And so once you get to the more intricate parts that have a bit more detail, you'll want to think about how to separate the different elements. It's actually as simple as planning out what color to use for the shirt, the coat, the inside of the coat, the belt buckle, and so on. And don't think about the small details yet, but keep your mind on the big picture. Simply put, everything needs a base color to work from. As far as the masking goes, I like to use a combination of the green liquid masking and some plain masking tape. The inside of the coat has a light grey color, and usually I would also pick out a lighter and a darker grey to go with it, just to put in some of the highlights and shadows along in this step. But again, the anime style. Clean, vibrant, strong colors. The coat itself, or the outside, has a green and black checkered pattern to it. So I think the best way forward would be to use the light green as a base color, so that later on, when it comes to painting on the checkered patterns, which I'll be doing with a paintbrush, I will definitely achieve a better result when using black on top of a bright color. I continue to paint my way through the different pieces, and as I get to Nezuko's hair, honestly, this is actually when it feels more like painting, as you're not constricted by the masking tape and such. She has long black hair with an orange color on the end. So using my airbrush, I slowly took my time building up the gradients between the black and the orange. I did feel the orange came out looking a bit flat, so I did apply some bright red at the very edges of all the tips. This red paint was actually thinned out quite a bit, as this helps to get the transitions looking more seamless. And I do believe it made it look a lot better. As for finding the skin tones, for me, that was a tough one. I believe the reason is that I usually use a lot of different colors for this, but you really can't do that with this style of painting. I ended up giving Nezuko a slightly bleaker color than Tanjiro, cause, well, she's a demon after all, and living in a box. Instead of mixing it directly in the airbrush cup, you can of course mix up all your paints in small bottles. This way, you'll be sure to have more than enough. Now this might surprise some of you, but at this point, my wife actually jumped in to help as well. You see, we do a lot of this stuff together. You might say we are both pretty passionate when it comes to making stuff. And sharing this passion makes it even more fun. She actually prefers to use paintbrushes, so this is actually her first time using the airbrush. Of course, she made it look really good. You should all know I am a big fan of using this green stuff liquid masking, And even though I usually put on a single coat of this stuff, it's almost like peeling off a thick elastic piece of rubber. Of course, using some sort of masking tape is the only way to give you those clean, crisp edges. But I've come to learn that when using the liquid masking, I can work a lot faster, especially since I don't waste a lot of time worrying about getting that perfect edge to begin with. And as you can tell, I'm usually left with a bit of a cleanup. This is something I like to go over with a small paintbrush. And even if I had put in a lot of work and time, putting down a lot of precision masking tape, I believe I still would have gone over it again with a small paintbrush. So ultimately, the liquid masking, it may look a bit messy, but it saves me a lot of time, and it ends up looking just as good in the end. With every base coat applied, all the masking removed, and all the lines cleaned up on every single piece, it's actually time for the final step of the paint job. And just as previously, make sure you organize your surroundings to best suit the work you're doing. In this case, we'll be using some acrylic paint and some plain paintbrushes. And having saved up some of the paints I mixed up earlier, it will be a lot easier to make all the small details match up perfectly. And speaking of details, to help me keep a steady hand for painting some of this really small stuff, I made this thing. Just a simple piece of wood that I used my belt sander on, to make sure my hands could rest comfortably on it, even at different angles and heights. And it may look kind of silly, but this helps me out a lot, and it suits my needs perfectly. Whenever you're painting with a paintbrush, especially when you want a clean, fully opaque coverage, personally, I find the most important thing to get right is the consistency of the paint, or rather the fluidity, if that's a word. You may have to apply some acrylic thinner to your paint, and I really do wish I could tell you exactly how much you would need, or that it would be some kind of fixed ratio to it. But that all depends on the thickness of your paint. You'll want to look for that thick, creamy fluidity, and if you get it just right, not only will your brush hold a lot more paint, but you'll manage to get those clean lines on the first pass. And usually, you'll only need a single coat of paint to achieve a good coverage. There really wasn't all that much details to the first piece, and since the pants were already done, I could simply go ahead and assemble them. I would much rather prefer to use some 2-part epoxy glue, but for these smaller parts, I do believe you'll only need a few drops of some CA superglue. And with the first larger piece finished, it was simply a matter of applying it to the base. And even now, I can tell it's gonna look really good. Just makes you want to keep going at it right away. Next would be the torso and all the checkered patterns. Gonna need a bit of patience for this. The way I go about this is I concentrate on fully painting one square at a time, starting by doing all 4 outer lines of the corners. Now, notice that I keep moving the piece around with my left hand, so that when holding the brush with my right hand, my dominant hand, I can move the brush more easily up and down, as it is a more natural position for my hand and wrist to move this way. This'll give me a clean line on the first pass, every time, almost. If you manage to get the right consistency to the paint, you won't be able to see any of the brush strokes, just a flat, clean surface. The sleeves of the coat were also painted, before I moved on to some of the smaller details, like the neck collar and the buttons on the shirt. It's actually painted in a light grey color, but it's such a contrast to all the darker colors surrounding it that it actually gives the appearance of being a pure bright white. And that may actually be a perfect example for whenever you're mixing up a new color. Try and make it a habit of testing out the colors first. You only need a couple of test strokes on the thing you'll be painting. Just seeing the different colors together like that might alter the appearance of them completely. This might save you from making some color mistakes, and ultimately make it a lot easier to achieve the exact look you want to create. The sword sheath was painted in a matte black color, and obviously a fragile thing sticking out like that could easily break off at any time, so I won't be attaching it before the very end. The hands and the sword hilt were also painted in the same way. And since we're still working with such small parts, I believe that attaching them with some simple superglue would be more than enough. And thus, one more large piece was completed. When it comes to painting the face, we've already established the base coat. I usually follow up on this by using a pencil to gently lock in the positioning of the eyes and the eyebrows. The pencil marks are barely visible, but that's all I really need. I pick out a light gray color for the eyes, and notice just as previously, your eyes might deceive you a bit, because this looks to be a plain white, or at least until you place a really white color beside it. If you take away the white again, and place a darker gray beside it, it appears to look white again. Just something to keep in mind when testing out your colors. When it comes to the actual painting of the eyes, I like to thin out the paint a bit more than I usually would. It may be just a personal preference, but I kind of feel the paint flows better, even though it means you have to apply 2 coats. And it definitely helps for when it comes to painting really thin lines, like with the eyelids, and especially with the eyebrows. And like the saying goes, go slow to go fast. Taking your time is really the way to go when dealing with these small precise details. And I almost forgot to mention, but I did apply a coat of some satin varnish before I started. So for instance, if you were to make a simple mistake when painting it, and if you act quickly enough, you can simply wipe it off again using a semi-wet cloth, and just try again. The inside of the cheeks were given a slightly deeper skin tone. And as for the tongue, I went with a strong red color. You can probably see it a lot better now as I paint the hair in a pitch black color. The anime style of painting has a lot of hard contrasts. There's no transitions between the different elements. There's no shadows, not even highlights to add in later. Only strong, clean, vibrant colors. I'm only mentioning this again because it is such a totally different way of painting than what we usually show you on our channel. It may look a bit off and maybe even a bit childish, but I promise you, it's only when everything is finished that it all comes together and will look really good. When it comes to the face, putting in the iris and the pupils will make all the difference. It's kind of a make or break moment. So I thought, instead of painting in the eyes this time, I'll show you another technique that will make it look just as good. The first step, of course, will be to finding a good quality picture of just the eyes. You can of course simply Google it and find a JPEG with a good resolution. Or you can simply draw them up yourself. For instance, I recently discovered a drawing app called Procreate. Yeah, I know, I'm kinda late to the party on this one. I believe it only took a 5-minute tutorial, and I felt I already had learned all I needed to know to get going. And drawing up a couple of eyes isn't really that challenging. The next thing you'll need to do is getting them printed out on some water sliding decal paper. Pretty sure you can buy it online on just about any hobby or craft store. I only needed to print out 2 sets of eyes, but seeing as you have a whole page to fill out, I went ahead and made a whole bunch of stuff in different styles. It was printed out on a simple inkjet. But before we can use them, you'll want to go ahead and give it 1 or 2 coats of some clear glossy varnish. I use a simple rattle can for this, and I apply 2 thin coats of it. This is simply to prevent the colors from the printout from bleeding out at a later stage. And once this varnish has fully cured, we can start cutting out all the pieces we need. And as the name suggests, water decals. You actually only need water to make them stick to the surface, because when they are softened up with the water, they will come loose from the paper backing, leaving only the decal with a thin layer of glue on the backside. However, I would recommend using some of this, Tamiya decal solution. This will definitely make it easier to get a good result. As far as tools go, you'll need some cotton swabs, some tweezers, and a small paintbrush. Once you have your piece cut out, you'll need to soften it by applying some water. You can actually buy a box that is specifically designed for this, but that would mainly be useful if you were to do a lot of them at the same time, like when applying them to custom Gundam kits for instance. So in this case, we'll only be needing a glass of water and some paper towels. Grab one of the pieces you cut out and place it on top of the wet paper towel. And as for applying it, if you're right-handed, always start with the left side. This will make it a lot easier to line them up perfectly without your hand getting in the way as you place the last one. First, make sure to brush on some of the softener. Then using a small brush, gently grab the decal and apply it to the surface. If you don't manage to place it correctly on the first try, then just use your paintbrush to gently slide it into the position you want. This is why we apply the decal softener first, so you can easily move it around. When both eyes are in place and lined up correctly, you can gently roll over them with a Q-tip. This will make sure you get rid of any air bubbles that may be trapped underneath. And as a final step, brush on some more of that decal softener. And then you can just leave it to dry. And I almost forgot this, but of course we have to lock in his signature earrings. These were also drawn up in Procreate. Unfortunately, I had some good reference for this. I actually got these for my wife on our 22nd year anniversary last year. Pretty cool. The longsword. It's probably the simplest detail to paint so far. The only thing to keep in mind is trying not to get any visible brush strokes. You might think this is a base coat for some sort of steel or chrome finish, but actually, as part of the Demon Slayer story, Tanjiro hasn't gotten his sword color as of just yet. His sword is simply black. So to make it a bit more interesting, and because I just got a hold of something I've been wanting to try out for quite a while, I'll be giving it a second coat of black paint. Only this time, it's a type of light absorbing paint. It was a bit thick and difficult to paint with, but it truly came out looking pitch black. I don't believe you can really get a good sense of it from just looking at the video, but in real life, well, it sorta looks like a hole in reality, in lack of a better description. It's really cool, and I wonder what else I can use it on. For the details on the wooden box, it was just a simple, straightforward paint job. Just make sure you have the right consistency to the paint. And move your piece around a lot, making sure you have the best possible angle for moving your paintbrush. And with a little practice, you'll be able to work much faster this way. And more importantly, you won't leave any visible brush strokes. I've never really cared for using those expensive paintbrushes. That's probably why some of my brushes sometimes get an odd bend to them. I bet you could see the bent one I just used on the box. In fact, if you experience this, you should try applying some brush repair gel. I'm not exactly sure if it repairs anything, but it certainly straightens them out again. My wife already painted several parts for the final figurine, so I was left with only a few details. As for painting the fingernails, painting them was rather easy, but getting the top bevel of each fingernail to look right and giving them the right size in proportion to each other on such a small detail. I usually use 4 sets of different glasses just to get around. I actually had to take a couple of still photos just to make it focus correctly on those little dots. Of course, I could have taken a shortcut or two, but with all patience, the devil is in the details, right? And with every last part fully painted, it was time to assemble it all. Honestly, it's the most satisfying part of the whole build. Just seeing something that you've put so much work into, quickly coming together at the very end like that. Truly, such a good feeling. Thinking back to when I wanted to test assemble things, just prior to painting it, I did learn that when it came to putting it all together, it would prove to be a bit of a puzzle. So the essential key would be the order of things. That's why I didn't attach the figurine just yet, but rather I chose to start with the display base. And that's all made of resin. So I made the choice to go with some more UV resin, but this time use it as a sort of a glue. It's all the same materials. It would still be fully transparent. And besides, if it ended up being any gaps between the parts, I could simply fill it in, piece by piece. I used some super glue on the piece that held the longsword. I know that looks kind of risky, but it's only meant to be used as a clamp, just giving me enough time to attach the large swirly thing. It went from the bottom, around the back, and bent up towards the top again, finally connecting it to the longsword piece. As it was time to fit the final piece, I noticed something at the last minute. I'd actually forgotten a small but rather important detail. It's funny sometimes that even though you're so focused on the tiniest details, you can almost miss something like this. If I had already glued it on, it would be a lot more difficult to fix it. But as it stands now, it was simply a matter of getting it painted. And then came the moment of truth, covering all the water parts with a thin coat of some regular epoxy resin, giving everything that crystal clear see-through glass appearance. And just as usual, when I work with mediums like this, I use my breathing mask, always, and I keep my ventilation on, all the time while applying it. But with this type of slow curing resin, there's always the risk of having dust settling on it. So, as soon as I was finished, I shut off everything, even made sure to close all the windows and doors to my workshop, and then I left my air purifier on to run all night. Hopefully, this would be good enough to get it cured without having any dust sticking to it. I was hoping I was right about this, but I wouldn't find out till the next day. And for once actually, everything turned out just the way we planned it. Or maybe we just got lucky. Nevertheless, it actually ended up looking even better than what we had hoped for, and I couldn't seem to find a single speck of dust on it. This means there's only one final step left. We'll have to create those foamy white parts that appear at the very top of the water waves. Now there's actually quite a few ways and materials you can use to achieve a look like that. But since we'll want it to match with the anime style, it would actually be simplest to just continue using what little UV resin we have left. We only need to give it an opaque white color. This is usually achieved by adding some powder-based color pigment. This stuff will go great together with epoxy resin, polyurethane resin, and even ultraviolet resins, like we're using right now. And instead of using a plain white color pigment, we actually picked out one with a bit of shiny sparkles to it. Just apply some mixed up resin with a small paintbrush, and then quickly cure it with the UV light. In the beginning, I only added a little at a time, but once I got used to working this way, I applied more and more, being able to work at larger spaces at one time. It's not like I'm painting it, since I'm adding more volume to the model, but to me it actually feels more like sculpting, so you'll have to be mindful where and how much you put on, because ultimately you might change the appearance of the model completely. So I made sure to simply follow the flow and add it to all the places that felt natural. It did take a while, but that was actually the last piece of work I did on this prop build. And there you have it, quite a long and comprehensive look through all the different steps that make up a model like this. Some of you might have done things a bit differently, but I guess you'll never find two makers doing things the exact same way. We really hope you learned something, maybe a trick or two, or even better, got some inspiration for your next project. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon. and we'll try and share our next build with you. Thank you for watching.